Leadership during periods of transition and growth isn't really about control. It's truly about clarity. People don't need you to do everything. They need to know what matters most and that they trust you to figure out the rest.
I'm joined by the amazing Liz Wright, EVP and Chief Financial Officer of Paramount Plus. What role does that conversation around trust and culture have in ensuring that you deliver that performance, that you deliver that strategy?
For me, trust is really foundation of everything you do. Trust isn't automatic just because of a title, right? It's earned over time and really through consistency, through learning, and how you show up in moments that really matter. Because really when people feel heard, they become open more to partnership. When we really show up as partners who are curious, solutions oriented, and aligned to the outcome, that's when, trust starts to follow.
Thanks, Liz. Liz, it's lovely to have you on the Fall Forward podcast today. Lovely to have a Blend member here with us in the podcast. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here.
Liz, as you know, Fall Forward podcast is all about talking about the challenges, the difficulties that we have as leaders. Because as we go through our careers, of course, we fall over as much as we succeed. And it's really important for us to share that story and share those stories with members as we grow through our leadership journey. So thank you for being with us and thank you for being generous with your experience today. Let's start with that, I suppose, that area of when things don't go to plan. We'll chuck you in at the deep end and perhaps you can share with us something that you learned or something from a lesson that you really took when it didn't go to plan.
Yeah, for sure. So I'll start with something that might sound familiar to a lot of leaders. And that's really that moment when the business is in a period of, rapid transition and growth, and your instinct is to, hold everything close to yourself. And I'd say for me, that moment came a few years ago when we were scaling our streaming business and bringing together multiple teams, some new strategies, and really a brand that was evolving faster than anyone expected. So it was definitely an exciting time, but it was also, pretty chaotic. And I feel like every decision felt like it was, high stakes. And I was in a mindset of if I could just stay on top of everything, whether that be every forecast, every slide, every meeting, we'll stay on track. And for a while it did work until it doesn't, right? And I remember a point when we were heading into a big planning cycle and the team was, truly running on fumes. And I was juggling earnings prep, major integration, and building out some new reporting frameworks. The quality of the work was still good, but I'd say the energy behind it wasn't. People were exhausted, and honestly, so was I. And the truth was, I hadn't failed at execution. I had failed at trusting the process I had built and the people around me. And I was really so focused on getting everything right that I left, little room for others to take on ownership as well. Ultimately, I thought I was, protecting the outcome, but really I was limiting the growth of the team and really my own growth as a leader. So as I kind of reacted to that, I started delegating more intentionally. But I'd say the key to that was not just like task oriented, but decision making. So I made space for others to grow and expand, even if it meant they'd make a few mistakes along the way. And what happened was really, truly incredible. I said, not only did the team step up, but they brought forward ideas that were, better than mine. And I say that was truly, a humbling and liberating moment for me. What I thought, what I really learned through that experience is that leadership during periods of transition and growth isn't really about control. I'd say really it's truly about clarity. And that's, I think, what's really important. People don't need you to do everything. They need to know what matters most, and that they trust you to figure out the rest. And that's really been core to my leadership philosophies, especially in a streaming business like streaming, where everything is moving, super fast. You can't be the decision maker on every decision. You really have to build a team of leaders and individuals around you who can operate confidently when you're not in the room, right? So taking care of everything. So as I think, a takeaway to your overall question, it's not really failure sometimes isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like overfunctioning or, being the person who has it all handled. But that kind of failure can really be the most transformative. it really, because it forces you to redefine leadership, what it really actually means. It's not really perfection, but really empowerment of your team.
Yeah, I love that thought because as you said, it's the very small incremental things that are happening every day. The big failures we're very aware of, and they're kind of relatively easy to learn from. But the change that you talk about there is small and incremental and consistent, and actually very difficult when I've spoken to leaders to achieve, because that feeling of accepting failure of your own is something that we can learn, but that feeling of a failure, accepting failure of others in your team can be even more challenging. How did you deal with that? How did you because I know for some that's the hardest bit, taking their hands off and really trusting. Is that about good recruitment? Is that about just giving your leaders the space to grow? How did you do that bit?
I think it's a mix of both. I've been really fortunate in my career to have a lot of longstanding leaders that have worked with me for a long time. So you think you build that rapport and that trust. But I think some of it is recruiting the right individuals. But I think it's building that trust between you and your leadership team, that you always have their back, right, regardless of what the situation is, and feeling like they know that they can make decisions without you, as long as ultimately you guys are in lockstep on the vision and the ultimate strategy.
Yeah, I think that's the second thing that really resonated with me there, was the clarity of message, the consistency and clarity of message. I think often we forget, don't we, as leaders, that we get in the detail of the doing and the perfection, as you said, chasing that, but actually consistency and clarity of message. So that's a lovely takeaway. Thanks, Liz. So much in the news at the moment about Paramount doing so well, and such a positive shift in the streaming part of the organization, obviously where you lead. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, achieved profitability a full year ahead of where you were supposed to be, which is incredible. How did you manage that? Because there's so much change going on in markets, let alone in the industry that you're in. What got you there? How did you manage it?
Yeah, great question. And one that, kept me up at night for a very long time
I
when
bet,
you
I
think
bet it
about
did.
things that keep you up at
Yeah.
night. So when I look back at how we reach profitability ahead of plan, I think it really came down to three things: focus, discipline, and transparency, which is kind of consistent with what the theme we just talked about before. So I'll start with focus and discipline. That was really getting very clear on what actually drives value in our streaming business, and looking at every lever through a profitability lens. So that meant everything from how we spend on content, how we market the service, to how we drive engagement on the overall platform. So we asked the hard questions. Is this investment, driving retention for us? Are we reaching the right audiences? And are we growing efficiently, not just quickly? I think that was really one of the key ones early there. So early on in streaming, we had made a deliberate shift in mindset. We were, from growing at all costs to really transitioning to growing sustainably with quality driven growth. And that really was a pivotal moment as we think about our business. In the early years of streaming, everyone was chasing scale. So it was really grow subscribers at any cost. But when we recognized that the real long-term success story wasn't written by was really important to be written by those who, scale profitability. So we really prioritize the growth to profitability, not just, scale of our subscribers. And when we think about that, that required some really tough calls. First off, we optimized our content slate. We really tightened our marketing spend, and we aligned on pricing and partnerships with long-term goals. So really not staying short-term focused, but focusing on the long-term. And then, none of those decisions were obviously very easy, especially in a creative industry that we work in, that really drives ambition and momentum. But what we did learn is that discipline doesn't stifle growth, it really sustains it. And then to the other point, transparency was also a really huge factor for us. We built a culture where data-driven decisions. So our data was really driving the decision, not the emotion of, for example, a piece of content that we want to renew. How did it perform versus, is there so much emotion around the title? And we looked at performance honestly. And we really made sure every team really understood what we were doing, and making sure it was a team effort behind it all. So that alignment, I think, was really key. It really turned profitability from being a finance goal to being more of a broader organization goal. So kind of bringing everybody along with you was really key there. And as I think about it, the biggest mindset change was moving from how big can we get to how efficiently can we grow. Um, and once that became the lens for decision making, everything really changed the approach to how we think about content, how we think about marketing, and even our broader partnerships. So profitability became not just a milestone, but really a muscle we were continuing to build within the larger organization. And ultimately, the reason that we hit the milestone a year early wasn't because of one, large decision. It was because of hundreds of small, intentional choices that we made that compounded over time. And I say, really, it was everyone across the business was pulling in that same direction. And that's really when you think about it, it's the power of the focus and the alignment of a team effort. And I think the broader lesson, even beyond streaming, is that discipline and creativity really aren't opposites. They work together, and they really unlock performance that is both sustainable but also inspiring.
Wow, Liz, there's so many questions I want to ask you there, because I love that. I love that discipline and creativity. Yes, so often they're at odds with each other, or they feel like they're at odds with each other, but actually, so eloquently put, together they're a powerhouse. I love that. You mentioned the discipline to the message and the kind of focus of the strategy, and the focus on the longer term. That can be challenging for leaders, often under pressure on short horizons, quarterly numbers. How is that delivered through the business? Is that, as an exec team, you're like, right, this is so important to us that we have to look on a slightly longer horizon? How did you come to that decision? Because being able to get your head up and away from that short-termism is a real challenge in enterprise.
It's a challenge I feel like we all face on a daily basis, because you get, especially as a large public company, you're very quarterly driven with earnings and reporting numbers to the street and guidance and expectations around your quarterly performance. And sometimes you get so caught up in that you haven't really thought about the long term. The key that we did is really thinking about, okay, here's our long-term plan and the milestones that we need to achieve to get there, which is really key, because otherwise it would have been a really hard go get. Now, there's a lot of short-term, long-term balancing act that you're constantly managing. And I'd say that doesn't come easy. So it's not losing sight of the long term, because if you don't focus on it as you get through the quarters, you'll never get there. But then also managing the dynamics of short-term expectations that you're trying to meet. So it's a balancing act. It's never easy. I think the biggest thing was getting everybody on the team on board that we had to hit this long-term milestone, and if we don't hit these individual milestones along the way, we'll never get there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose that's the skill of it. And obviously, congratulations, because beating it by a year is no small margin. And that's exciting to see. You mentioned something in there around getting everybody aligned, everybody focused to the same goal, the same piece. Working in finance, which is obviously very data driven and often, the numbers are the numbers. What role does that conversation around trust and culture have in ensuring that you deliver that performance, that you deliver that strategy? I always find that's really interesting to talk in the different areas of the business with this lens of culture and trust.
That's a great question. And it's really one that's very important to me. For me, trust is really foundation of everything you do. And it's something that you build long before you really need it, is the way I think about it. In cross-functional roles, obviously being CFO in finance, especially in a creative business like streaming, trust isn't automatic just because of a title, right? And I think that's consistent across a lot of different industries. My perspective is it's earned over time, and really through consistency, through learning, and how you show up in moments that really matter. And as we unpack that, I've learned that trust starts with listening before leading. So early in my career, I thought credibility came from having the right answers. Now I know it comes from asking the right questions, and really from taking time to understand, how other teams really define success, what pressures they're under, and what they're ultimately trying to solve for. Because really, when people feel heard, they become open more to partnership, and as you think about it. So in a role like mine, it's easy for finance to be sometimes seen as a gatekeeper, the one who ultimately says no. So I've worked really hard in my career to help flip that dynamic. I always tell my team, our job isn't to block creativity. It's more to help make it sustainable. So when we really show up as partners who are curious, solutions oriented, and aligned to the outcome, that's when trust starts to follow. When we show up, purely enforcers, so that no person, that trust definitely erodes pretty quickly. So that's one thing. And then I think about consistency being another big one. It's not just about getting the numbers right. It's about making sure your words, the data, and your actions are all aligned. So people really watch how you operate when things are calm, but I'd say they operate, they're looking at you when it's not. So if your, story or your behavior is consistent in both those periods of both calm and crazy, then that's how you build that trust, right? But, if you are constantly moving goalposts or change your messaging depending on who's in the room, also, that's another area that trust will evaporate pretty quickly. So the fastest way to lose trust in my, experiencing, two things you never do: overpromise, never overpromise, and withholding content. So not giving people full transparency onto what's going on. I've really learned in my career that people can handle bad news. What they really don't like is being surprised by it. So especially in high stakes environments like earnings or budget cycles or transformation, being consistent and transparent, even if it's uncomfortable, builds long-term credibility, right? So I'm an open book with both my team and my leadership team. I think that's one of the most important things. And I'd say one of the biggest shifts I've seen in modern finance leadership is that really trust isn't built on technical precision alone. It's really built on being empathetic and understanding to the business. So like when a marketing or creative team sees that you actually understand their business, but also understand behind the story behind the numbers, that's really when finance becomes more of a strategic business partner. And when you stop being like the finance person, and more started being a leadership part of the organization. So if I have to kind of summarize it up, I'd say trust is earned through alignment on intent and actions. It's really built quietly. It's lost very quickly, so you have to be careful with that. And ultimately staying by showing up with the consistent messaging, clarity, and I'd say genuine partnership, no matter what function, right? So I'm speaking from a finance seat, but I'd say any functional support or any business leader, it has the same principles, in my opinion.
Liz, you lead me on to this question really nicely, which is that you are, I would say, not typical of a finance leader in this stage of industry, in that you're so keen to partner across the organization and deliver value across the organization. Often that's still an emerging trait in the finance world, I would say. How open were your colleagues around the boardroom table to opening themselves up to partner with you? Because sometimes there can be a fear, oh no, the finance team are coming looking at what we're doing. If that comes with the wrong intent, then that can be a scary place for your colleagues to be, as much as an opportunity to be amazing. So how did that work with your board? And clearly from what you're sharing with us, it's become very successful from doing that. But I'd love to perhaps share some advice of how you kind of built those alliances around the boardroom table, if you can.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of it is that transparency and partnership, and making it feel like you weren't just trying to get answers, but really trying to understand their business and be a business partner. I think it really comes down to that, and be yourself, right? Like I think sometimes so you see so many people trying to be somebody who's liked or have this image of something. Being yourself and putting yourself out there, I think is half the battle, right? People truly can see when somebody's genuine. Um, and I think a lot of it also comes from asking questions and actually caring about what the business is doing. So not just saying, okay, asking it to ask it, but like actually understanding, how their team is structured, how they operate, what are some of the levers that they have in their business, because you can only be as good as the information that you know. So I've been very fortunate in my career that finance has been a business partner, in the 20 plus years that I've been doing it. However, I'd say it really came from building that reputation of somebody who, and my team as well, has built that reputation of being somebody that can be trusted, is a valued business partner. And when they're evaluating a new business idea or strategy or partnership, finance is always part of that conversation, which I think is really a testament to that, building that relationship with the team.
Yeah, you know you're getting it right when you're getting invited in. That's
Yes,
and clearly you are, Liz, for sure. Um,
exactly.
if I then kind of push that forward slightly, I mean, so you've driven to profitability faster than you're expecting to. The streaming space is kind of one of the spaces that's probably transforming at the rate of knots, and you've got AI coming in and all of these wonderful things that are making us all go faster. How have you been able to lead through this kind of constant change? This advertising shift, multiple M&As we were talking about before we went live with the recording. Uh, what's the kind of philosophy for dealing with that change? How are you going about that and leading through that and keeping a smile on your face, which you obviously are?
I've been through a lot of multiple mergers, multiple transactions in my career, so it's definitely a whirlwind. I'd say in our industry, in media in general, transformation isn't just a phase. I really think it's the norm state of our business, unfortunately, and a lot of that is the technology is constantly evolving, the consumer is evolving, and models evolve, right along the way with that. So the goal isn't to eliminate change, but it's really to help our teams get comfortable with it, to see that transformation as a capability, not really a crisis, right? Like it's the norm, but we kind of have to figure out how to manage through it and deal with it. And back to what we were originally talking about, I think it's actually pretty relevant here. For me, it really starts with clear communication. So in any major change, whether it's a reorg, an integration, or really a shift in strategy, because that happens obviously all the time. I always come back to two questions. What's changing and what isn't? And I think the what isn't is actually an important one, because when people understand both, it helps ground them. So if you're only talking about what's changing, it can somewhat feel, destabilizing, and people are like, oh my gosh, how am I living through this? But when you also anchor them on what's steady, so the mission, our values, the purpose, that can help, stand their footing so they can move forward with confidence, right? So it's keeping them apprised on what's changing, but really making sure they understand what's being stable. And I'd say, change is always happening around us. Sometimes it's gradual, sometimes it's all at once. But what matters is how we adapt to it. So I really encourage my teams to stay curious, stay flexible, and always keep learning, because I think the skills and strategies that worked last year might not work, unfortunately this year and next year. The people and teams who thrive in this industry and the ones who can adjust really quickly, stay open-minded, and also see change not as really a disruption, but an opportunity. I think those are the ones who can succeed and deal with that uncertainty. Um, Also, transparency really plays a huge role. People can handle uncertainty if they trust your clarity. And I've seen that time and time again during integrations, during budget resets, during M&A activity. I try to really over communicate context, um, even when the answers aren't final. Saying we don't know, but here's what we're working towards. I think that always is better than silence. Silence sometimes can be really unnerving for people, but it also signals to your team that you respect them. You're being honest with them of, listen, I only know this much. and here's the long-term goal, and I'll just keep you apprised. That I've seen really resonate with my team. Other things I've learned is that you have to, connect on short-term execution to get to those long-term visions. So, change is fatigue. That change fatigue, really starts to set in when people can't see their hard work is getting them to that long-term vision. So as you think about periods of transformation, I make it a point to really remind my teams how today's efforts are really going to help them with tomorrow's goals. And whether that's back to what we were talking about, achieving profitability, scaling globally, which we've been doing a lot of time the last couple of years on, and then integrating in new platforms, because things are constantly, tech is moving faster than we can all imagine right now. And that connection gives meaning to their work, even if there's bumps as you think about it along the way, they kind of can see the long-term vision. So, sometimes in a way, leading through transformation isn't about having answers, because we're never going to have them. But I think it's about creating clarity when the answers are still kind of forming, and really giving people confidence that we can navigate, what's next, right? We can always get through it. And I'd say the pace of our change is definitely not slowing. But if you build a team that can adapt, can learn, and stay, aligned on the purpose, I'd say really that's when change becomes your competitive advantage, and how you can kind of, move through it and continue to sustain operations.
I like this idea, Liz, that you talk about, that, it's constant. The being in a transformative state is constant, because often we've heard over time people talking about, transformation burnout, or the challenges that come with that, with the highs of trying to achieve transformation or change consistently. How have you managed to manage that with your team in terms of their kind of wellness, their overall kind of the roundness of being a team member and a leader, and looking after yourselves? Because you want to transform at pace, you want to go fast, you want everything happen really quickly, but there's also the reality of sustaining yourself over a long period of time. How have you managed to kind of marry those two things up?
Yeah, and it's definitely not easy. I think the transparency is really key to it. But I'd also say is recognizing, and not to get too much into like work-life balance, right? But which is always a very hard thing to achieve. But making sure that your teams have an out, right? Of like, listen, I understand that you have family, friends, other personal obligations. Work is also crazy, but finding that right balance, I think, is helpful to the team to kind of manage through it, because I've been in a phase for the last 4 to 5 years where it's been constant change. I was previously part of CBS that merged with Viacom, became Paramount, then we were acquired by Skydance. It's just been the last 5 years have been a lot of transformation, as you say. So it's finding that right balance for myself personally, but also for my teams, and making sure that they have the support to take a walk, go for a run, spend time with their kids, spend time with their pets, whatever their outlet is, to find that balance, because I don't see it changing, especially in the media world, anytime soon. There's constant consolidation and rethinking about how we get to profitability faster, and how do we offset linear declines? It's just a world that we're faced with. So I don't think that's going to change at all anytime soon. So it's just like finding a way to support your teams through it.
Yeah, sure. My wife said to me, Liz, not long ago, she said, work-life balance. She says, you have work and you have a life, but they're not in balance. But it's okay. She said, but it's okay. You just have to commit to doing one of them very well at a time. And
that is actually very true. I say that all the time.
Yeah, and it's I have to say, it really stuck with me. She's like, I'm okay with you being the best dad in the world, as long as you're the best dad in the world for the time that you're being the best dad in the world. At the same time, when you're in the office or at work, I want you to be the best at work. So you have to focus on that too, and those two things are okay. And it's always stuck with me, and I heard it in your answer very clearly, which is great. I suppose we've talked about the clarity, the trust, the consistency of message. What are some of the invisible skills, perhaps, that you've developed and that you carry as a leader? And I suppose your leadership power, how it's evolved over time. What's less obvious to others that you might really think about?
Yeah. So I think a lot about the invisible work, and especially as a female leader, do sometimes the things that don't show up on paper, but make, all the difference on how a team really functions. In some ways, it often looks like, emotional, like trying to get through. But I think a lot of it is mentoring, creating really inclusive culture where you're reading the room, creating safety and space where that doesn't naturally exist. So, whether it be a check-in after a tough meeting, and really how we hold space for other when tensions are really high, or how we anticipate what people need before they even ask. That's leadership too. It's not just always, recognized as such, right? It's those small bits and pieces as you think about being a leader that I think really matter. Sometimes early in my career, I equated power with competence and control. And I thought that being powerful meant being the most prepared person in the room or the one who had every answer to every slide or every scenario, and you had it all covered. And there's value in that. But over time, I really realized that the kind of power is limited, and it keeps you in a mode of constantly proving yourself, and not really leading your team. So as I've grown, my definition of power, I'd say, has completely shifted. Now it looks more like clarity and being calm under pressure, back to what we were talking about. It's also being the person who can create focus in a noisy room, especially what saying, here's what matters most when sometimes everybody's like spinning on things. I think it's like staying calm in those periods of chaos is far more powerful than being, perfect. I've also learned, authenticity and empathy, aren't really soft skills. I'd say they're leadership accelerators as you think about yourself. The more people, the more real you really are, the more people trust you. So I think being human, you're going to have flaws. You're going to do great one day, and then one day you have something going on, and that's who you are. But I think when people trust you, they'll follow you anywhere, and not because they have to, but really because they want to. And I think that's how you distinguish yourself as a leader. And there's this belief that power is something you hold, but I think it's really something you share. So I'd say the greatest power that I think about is enabling others to rise with you. So thinking about your team, giving them the space, the voice, the confidence to really lead in their own way, right? So like every person on your team isn't going to do the things exactly the way you did, but giving them the space so that they can become their own leader, I think is really important. And I found, the higher you go in your career, it's less about proving your strength and more about multiplying it to others and having the rest of your team kind of continue to grow. Because I will say this one thing, you are only as good as your team. And I always say that, and it's the truth. Because as a leader, there's not an I, you're a team. So more for me, it's been more about, moving from control to connection, more from really not power as authority, but power as impact to your leaders. And that often, not only made me the better leader, it made me feel more human. And I think that ultimately, when you think about power, ultimately makes you more powerful.
I love that you finished with how it makes you feel too, because actually, yes, you want your teams to be amazing, but at the same time, yeah, giving yourself that feeling of success is a big part of it, right? To know that you're leading in a way that you're proud of and that you're impassioned by. If I can I add something to your list, Liz? You're one of the kindest people I've met in our blend membership journey, and I think often kindness is underplayed as a leadership strength, and can be seen as a weakness. And I think you are such a great example of how kindness can be a real superpower, and speaking to all of that empathy and clarity and the like. So we're big advocates for kindness, and there's a difference between kindness and niceness, of course. And often
I completely
that's a
agree.
thing that, in fact, we had a whole session with the author Graham Alcott a couple of weeks ago in London, who wrote a book on this very topic. And it really resonated with me. He was, saying that, actually to be the kindest and most successful leader, you also don't need to be the nicest. And so anyway, I just want to take my hat off to you and say that you embody everything within that as well. Um, one of the things that we do, Liz, on the Fall Forward podcast is that we ask our members for some questions to pick your brains, to share some things that, that hopefully will be helpful for them. If I think about, we talked a little bit earlier about, you know, your ability to get across the boardroom and build allies or partners across the boardroom. The question from the member actually comes related to that. And it's more about, what do leaders underestimate about influencing peers? What is it that they're not thinking about that you found useful in your toolkit?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest misconceptions about, influencing at that executive level is that it comes from, being a certain title or a function. And in reality, influence isn't positional, it's relational, right? So back to that relationship, you could have, the biggest title in the room, but if people don't trust your intent, your influence is going to be limited, right? So if they don't really believe in what you're saying. So at the C-suite level, everyone is smart, obviously very capable and accountable for results. I think what differentiates the leaders who are truly influencing others is how they operate. How do they show up when things are unclear? When priorities compete or when decisions get tough, right? I think when things get hard is really when you start to see people differentiate themselves. And I'd say the C-suite, values leaders who can, simplify complex matters and complexity and make others, better in the process. So when you take a complex issue, whether it be financial, operational or creative, and distill it down to how it matters, people start, looking for you for not just, answers, but really clarity. And that's what real influence, in my opinion, looks like. It's not about having, the loudest voice, because that's obviously not who I am. But it's about being the person who can create that calm and direction in moments when things are ambiguous and there's not that clarity. And I've also find that credibility builds through consistency. Back to what we were talking about earlier, is you build trust by showing that you can care about the company as a whole, and the division that you're in, not just your own function, right? So you're not only me, myself, and I, you're thinking about the whole company. And I'd say when your peers know that your goal is the collective success, which I think is key, that you're invested in their challenges, just as much as your own, I'd say collaboration becomes much more easy, right? So it's a team effort. Back to, when we were kids and you play team sports, it's all about like that team, aspect of it. Also, influence comes from preparation, perspective. So when you walk into a conversation, having done the work, not just understanding the numbers, but also the narrative. So I'd say like the why behind what's going on. I think people notice, especially in finance, they don't want to just hear numbers. They want to understand like the business reason. Numbers make sense, but like, how do you put it into perspective? In my perspective, that's really shown respect for their time and their expertise, right? So you're kind of dumbing it down so it's relatable to all. And I've realized that the best way to really influence is through, clarity when it's hardest to find. So in moments when things are ambiguous or decisions are hard or messy and emotions are super high, or trade-offs are really real, you find a way to articulate that clean path forward, even if imperfect. You become the person somebody relies on. And that's, ultimately how trust, in my opinion, is built, and really sustained at that C-suite. So it's not at that level, it's not influence isn't about persuasion. It's more about that partnership. And it's, about being the kind of leader who others want in the room when stakes are high, right? So it's not like, oh, I have to include finance. I want to include finance, or whatever the individual is responsible for. So that partnership, I think, is the key to the underpinning of it all.
Yeah, I like this idea of that you mentioned, really, about influence as a leader was kind of used to be about getting your own way, and what you're saying is influence now is about impact, and in succeeding together, and that's definitely something that I love to hear about. We're going to be cheeky because there are actually two good member questions, Liz. The other is obviously Paramount is scaling globally. Markets everywhere. What's your biggest lesson? And obviously, as a blend membership community, we're we're or increasingly all over the world. So for leaders and members listening, what's been your biggest lesson leading globally? That was the question.
Yeah. So leading a global scale has truly, I'd say, probably been one of the most humbling and rewarding parts of my career. Obviously, I started my career in the US and was really US focused. But I realized that as you operate across, multiple regions, different time zones, different cultures, which is a real thing, the first, lesson you learn is humility. So it's not one size fits all. That never really works. I think that was a first lesson I learned. And what works beautifully in one market might completely be wrong and miss the mark in another. So I'd say, the instinct can be to really centralize a lot of things. I think I've gone through iterations of this in my career to drive consistency and efficiency. But I'd say global leadership is really about finding that right balance. So you need enough, structure to maintain alignment, but I'd say, but also enough flexibility to let the local teams adapt to really what resonates in their respective markets. So it's kind of finding that balancing act is really key. And I've also learned that local insight really has driven global success. So like not just that market can never be something we take, but we've actually taken some successes that we've done locally and instituted them globally. And I think that's empowering like the local leaders and having them feel like they have a seat at the table. And it's definitely really tempting to think centralization equals control, but really sometimes over centralizing things slows things down and really limits creativity. So, giving some of the regional leaders their own ownership, so not just accountability, but that authority helps them, drive better, faster decisions. And also helps them have that sense of autonomy, which creates a sense of pride and investment that no directive from, the global leadership headquarters could ever really do. So it's, I think, finding that balance. I'd say the other piece that is often sometimes underestimated is the cultural nuance that you see in certain regions. And I think respecting how people communicate, how they negotiate and decisions isn't just really about, being a polite human. It's about being strategic, right? So market A definitely can be different than market B and how we think about partnerships, et cetera. And I think when you show like genuine curiosity about how their ways are different than others, that also, builds back to the trust and collaboration. I think that's really key. So it's not just being most effective global teams aren't ones that erase those differences. They try to leverage, okay, what are we doing in each market and what's really working. So if I had to distill it down into one lesson, I'd say really leading globally is less about like scaling your voice and more about amplifying other people's, right? So it's how to find that balance. It's, how to create connectivity and clarity across distance. It's hard, right? A lot of us are on Zooms all day and you don't get to have that face to face, which I think is sometimes missing, to really make sure that people feel like they're being heard and that you're driving towards the same mission. But when we do that all well, you're not just leading a global business. It's think about it as a global community, which I know Blend does a fantastic job of trying to build as well. So long and short, you have to kind of balance both when you're thinking about a global organization.
Yeah, that's also not always easy, is it? Because the identifying the right parts of those learnings and takeaways from a geographical perspective or from a diversity of thought perspective and applying them is the skill, isn't it? It's knowing what translates and how it translates. But I suppose as you point out, creating the environment with which to test those things, iterate them, and be happy to. It goes hand in hand, which is lovely to hear, and is a big part of the Blend ethos. So yes, absolutely. Thank you for shouting that out as well. So Liz, thank you so much. One of the things that we ask all of our guests on the Fall Forward podcast to do is to share with us a recommendation, and that could be anything from a book, a life skill, whatever it might be. But it's one thing, I suppose, that's really helped you in your leadership journey that you would share with others as advice or guidance to consider in their own leadership journey. So what would that be, Liz?
So I think, one thing that's made a real difference in my leadership journey is, creating space for myself to step back and recharge, because I think we all are or at least me, very A-type personalities, driven, 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 go, go, go. And it's easy to fall into the mindset that if you push a little harder or stay one more hour at work, or everything will fall into place. And from what I've learned, the truth is work will always be there. What really matters is showing up with the right energy, perspective, and then clarity. And that you can't do that if you're running on empty. And that's really important to remember. And for me, that reset comes from, time with family and friends. And honestly, I have 2 dogs who I adore. For some reason, they're like my stress outlet. And so I love spending time with them. And they have, that really has kept me grounded and present. Also, running is another way that I, clear my head. And I think it's best, especially before a big decision or a long day. It's like grounding yourself. I think finding that outlet is really important. And I've learned really that balance isn't about having time for everything, because you're not. And back to your wife's comment there, it's about giving yourself permission to pause and be present in one thing and be present in the other. I think that's really important. And to recognize that taking time for yourself isn't a break from really leadership. It allows you to be a better leader and to lead better. And when you make that space to reset, you come back with, clarity and keep everything moving forward. So I think it's really important that you take that time to recharge.
Liz, thank you so much. And you mentioned running. You're not far off your first full marathon, I understand. Is it just around the corner?
Yes. Yeah, later this month on the 26th of October, I'm doing the Marine Corps Marathon in DC. It's my first marathon, so I'm quite nervous. Work has been chaotic, so I am not trained as much as I would like to be. But you do what you got to do. I run a ton of halves, but I'm going to stay positive and get through it.
Well, the team said you've run loads of half marathons, so if you've done loads of halves, you're going to be great. You'll be absolutely fine. So I say that I've never run a marathon, so I couldn't honestly tell you. And nor am I built for running marathons, as most of my team and all our blend members will attest to. Liz, thank you so much. I've loved spending the time with you as always. You're a wonderful blend member and an incredible leader. And thank you for sharing with us your insights. So many to take away: trust, clarity, consistency of message, and so much for our members to unpick. So thank you so much. And we will see you very soon, I know.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great conversation. Looking forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks, Liz. Make sure you subscribe to the 4 Forward channel so you don't miss any new episodes. I'll see you soon.